I have a question to ask you. Do you ever get decision paralysis when it comes to wanting to do the right thing for God? Like, you want to do God's will, but what if what you do is actually the wrong thing? You might just screw everything up if, say, you choose to go right when God wanted you to go left. If that's you, then I have a story to tell you. I am Kevin Neville, and you are listening to the Jesusland stories. We begin this story about 2 months ago at the end of my driveway. I was taking my wife into the beautiful city of Canandaigua for a dinner date. Now, I usually turn right at the end of my driveway, take the direct route through the town of Bloomfield. But you know what? Such a gorgeous fall evening, why don't I take the scenic route? So instead of turning right, at the last second I decided to turn left. And that's when I saw the sign. Just a tiny thing in the middle of this great field where the property line, our property line ends and the neighbor's farm fields begin. A tiny for sale sign. Okay, this needs a bit of history here. The fact is, about a year ago from the recording of this podcast, my family and I were led by God to buy a horse farm. Now, we actually got this farm in a miracle in and of itself. But that's a story for another day. Let's just say that when we got this place, it was only half the plan. You see, the land that it was on was a divided homestead. When the parents of the owners passed the land on to their kids, they divided it into thirds. 1/3 was given to the daughter, who was our neighbor. She built a house, she moved a family in, they grew old together there. And on the other side, on the far side, was farmlands given to the brother, maintained and used for crops. And the brother lived elsewhere, but he was still using this land for crops. The middle part was the old family farmhouse, where the barns and houses and accoutrements all stood. And this is the part that we purchased. The sisters' land is divided by a tree line, but the brothers' field, now the brothers' field is divided right in the middle of ours. And when I first saw the property, my first thought was, this land belongs together and needs to be put back together. Not only is it beautiful, flat, ready to build, in my spirit I could see the ministry centers, the horse rings, the gazebos. So when we finally bought the land, I made a simple prayer. Lord, thank you for this house, for this barn, for this land, but it's not complete. One day, when things get going, Lord, please help us purchase that field to complete this land. And there it was. About 9 months after we moved in, the for sale sign. Now, much earlier, I was prepared to wait at least 4 or 5 years. I figured it would be 4 or 5 years, and then one day the brother would approach us to see if we were interested in buying the land. I had made the assumption that he would come over and say, okay, I'm ready to sell. Are you interested? 4 or 5 years because we had no more money. We had just bought in a farm, for goodness sake. But there was the sign, and you couldn't argue with the fact. So we had to make a quick plan. We were going to eat a nice dinner, then we were going to come home and we were going to phone the number written on the tiny for sale sign, and we're going to see what's what. Well, I'll tell you what's what. When we phoned the brother, he told us right up front that the land already had a buyer, and that the buyer needed to close the deal quickly before his finances dropped out. And he said he had less than 24 hours to close this deal. Well, my heart went into my throat. I couldn't breathe. However, perhaps he would sit down with us and we could at least talk if there's any possibilities. So in the next hour, we found ourselves sitting around the table of our new farmhouse with the brother, and we heard all about how the buyer was excited. He was going to buy some land in the country where he could build his family a house and settle down. The problem being that this house would be dead smack in the middle of where I envisioned this ministry center going. Did I hear wrong from the Lord? It wouldn't have been the first time. However, did I miss the will of God somehow? Well, our guests heard our vision, and he readily admitted that it would make more sense to sell the land back to us. It was once the family land altogether, after all. They admitted that the deal with the other buyers, it wasn't finalized yet, and there were many other possibilities for this family to go and buy some land to build. The problem was selling it to them was a solid plan. And so he asked us, could we in fact make such a promise? I had to be honest with him. We couldn't. We didn't have the funds to cover the asking price, nor did we have a clear path or a way to promise him that we could get the money. We could only give them our promise of the desire to do that. Well, they explained to us that the clock was ticking for the other buyers and that they needed to sign the contract within 24 hours to make sure that everything just didn't vanish for them. So he asked us, could you do it in 24 hours? We agreed to try. So my prayer was simply this: Lord, I think this is your will. I can't really be sure. I can't say for sure, but I mean, if it is, we need another miracle here. And if it's not, then we need to trust you. Either way, please lead us in your will. Well, for the next 24 hours, we approached mortgage brokers who said no because there was no building on that for a mortgage. The bank said that we could get a home equity, but it would take about a month to get the right answer from them. We couldn't give assurance of it in just a few hours. So we were looking for God to give us his answer. Does God do Hail Marys? Trying to think of the theological ramifications of that. Sorry, Mom, but it is what it is. But in much the same way God came through with us the first time, he came through the second. We made a random call to check on a random investment that we had that we were convinced wasn't going to be available for many years to come. But the answer we got back was, yeah, sure. These funds are available to you if you need them. That's all we needed. Before the 12 hours had ended, we were able to give both our assurance of available finances and a firm handshake to map out the road ahead. Now, this week at the recording of this, we began 2025 as I walked the 18-acre farm that we had just closed on in its completion. It was a beautiful canvas just waiting for God to send the breathtaking artists that will be working with us. And I can't wait. I close my eyes right now and I could see it happening. This community that God is putting together to see life happen on that farm. But here's the question I always ask when it comes to the will of God. What if instead of going left, I had turned right? Now, you always hear people's stories of how their lives were changed for the good. And you track it back, and it usually happens by an arbitrary small decision that changed everything. I was planning on staying home that night, but at the last minute we went out, I met the love of my life, and everything changed. I wasn't even going to send in that application, but I accidentally misdirected it and it got there anyways. I happened to meet the right person at the right time because of a seeming fluke, and it changed the path of our entire life. Well, that all sounds well and good when you look at it in retrospect. But what about when you're living it? Lord, I want to do your will. But what if I take the left staircase instead of the right one, and everything you had for me depended on who I was going to meet going down the right staircase? Instead, I would die sad and alone because I went left. After all, Lord, I'm pretty darn unlucky. But what does luck have to do with it? The decision paralysis is something that creeps into my life. I want so much to live in the kingdom of God, to say, not my will, but yours be done. To do what he has called me by taking it step by step by step. But what if I miss a crucial step? What if I say or think or do the wrong thing? What if I go right instead of left? Don't you get it? My counselor told me when I brought up this great stress to her. If your heart is in obedience and your desire is to do his will, then there is no turning right. Well, what do you mean? That God gives you the desires of your heart, but he also puts those desires in your heart when you let him mold you. Then he directs your footsteps to those desires. It's not part of your plan. It's part of his. Okay, yeah. But what if I had turned right that day? We wouldn't have even known the land was for sale until the contract had been signed and the building project had begun. And then none of this would have happened. I would have missed God's will had I turned right instead of left. I will repeat, she said. There is no turning right. Yeah, but what does that mean? That had you gone that way through Bloomfield instead of the scenic route, then the will of God would have tracked you down and pursued you instead of waiting for you to stumble upon it. You've had people in your life that you had to say the right things to. You had to do the right things at the right time, or you know they would fly from your life. And that tension is very real with you. The stress that someone is going to vanish if you do the wrong thing is something you carry every day and something that needs healing. And the truth is, you aren't wrong. There are people like that. But that's not God. The will of God can't be missed. It could either be accepted or rejected. But there's simply no just turning right. We sometimes see the kingdom of God like this fragile thing that will only happen if all the elements are perfect and the gentle people tiptoe to find it. But rather, it's something that violent people take by force. The violent meek, the violent pacifist peacemakers, the violent child of God, not violent in an evil, hurtful, destructive way, but violently tearing down the world's mindsets and lies and path. The kingdom of God belongs to such as these. So go into 2025 with this confidence as we dive into all that the kingdom of God is and is not. The will of God has already gone ahead for this whole year. And although there are many choices and decisions and directions to choose from, rest assured that when it's time to turn left, if your heart is to follow the will of God, you will steer that car left. And it will be a beautiful thing indeed. not always fun, not always easy, but beautiful. I mean, following the will of God isn't always a carnival, but I could say it's always an adventure. That does remind me of another story of a time I explored a Christian-themed amusement park. But let's save that story for another time. This is Kevin Neville. Thank you for tuning in to Jesusland Stories. Keep growing in the kingdom, and I will see you next time. Hey guys, it's Kevin again. What you heard was a podcast that we're calling the Jesusland Stories. And this is episode 2, but for many of you know that I'm in the middle of a writing project on a book called Jesusland. First book is out, it's available on Amazon, but there's actually 4 books that will be following after that. And I found myself, I know where I'm going, I have all the chapters outlined and detailed, but sometimes finding your way to telling the stories properly take a little bit of time. So in between the writing of book 1 and book 2, I decided to start putting out these monthly Jesusland stories where we're going to go through all the chapters of the Jesusland story and just tell the stories parts of it. I am a storyteller. I love hearing stories. So we are going to explore the kingdom of God through its stories. And who better to show us the way than Jesus, who taught us the parables, the kingdom of God in stories. This is episode 2. I hope you tune in as we go on this adventure. I'm Kevin Neville, and I'll see you next time on the Jesusland Stories.